Nigeria's rising debt profile has once again been brought to the front burner following the release of the 2018 third quarter report of the Debt Management Office.
And figures released by the DMO showed that the federal government's domestic debt profile rose to 15.8 trillion naira in September 2018 from 15.6 trillion in the same year. Now, as of June of 2018, Nigeria's debt profile was pegged by the DMO at 20. In the same year. Now, as of June of 2018, Nigeria's debt profile was pegged by the DMO at 22.4 trillion naira. That's about 73.2 billion naira. Nigeria's debt to GDP, dollars, as a matter of fact. Our debt to GDP ratio at 69.8% is 19.8% higher than the 50% recommended by the IMF and the World Bank. Of course, you know, over and over again, we've heard from, you know, economic handlers, from government, that our debt to GDP ratio is really not an issue. But other, you know, economic experts will tell you, yes, that's not a problem. But the real issue is our debt to revenue ratio.
Exactly, because if you calculate debt to GDP ratio, it's normal.
Yeah.
It's normal. But if
debt
you
to
go
revenue
deeper,
right now is about 40%.
If you go deeper, and then the revenue, the standard of living, when you check them against those background, that's where the real issue is.
Yes, indeed.
All right. We have a macroeconomic economy policy analyst, Professor Ken Ife, joins us now from our Abuja studio. Professor Ife, good morning. It's good to have you join us.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much. Now, I know we've talked about this so many times, but it seems there is no remedy to the debt profile going down and so on. But in the mind of an average Nigerian, when the figures keep going up and he hears these figures every day, it looks like he has to panic and there's apprehension all over the place. Talk to us about how relaxed we should be as far as these figures are concerned, if we have to be.
I think we have every reason to be comfortable about the debt situation in Nigeria. Let me make an opening statement here to say that Nigeria is not in debt crisis.
Okay.
What Nigeria is in revenue crisis. And I hope we can unpack this. And then also look at debt management strategy, debt profile, then revenue strategy, revenue profile, and come to some conclusions and advice on how the government should actually proceed to bring more comfort to people in our debt management. Now, you know, the Fiscal Responsibility Act actually set the foundation for what we're having today, which was in 2007, because in 2005 we had calamity, where we owed so much and a huge proportion of our revenue was going to servicing debt. And eventually we had debt forgiveness. Yeah. And we had the lowest debt to GDP ratio in 2007, which was 11%. But let me quickly go to some figures to bring you to speed on the fact that we are not in debt crisis. I have two authorities for you. First of all, CIA looked over from 2004 to 2017, in fact 2018. It looked at, focused on the GDP growth to debt to GDP ratio of all the countries in the world. And Nigeria came out to be the number 189, just close, only 5 people, but 5 countries. Now, if you look at the top, number 1 there is Japan. Japan has a debt to GDP ratio of 223%, followed by Greece, 180%. In fact, African countries appeared, Gambia, 116%, and then you have the likes of Ghana, 66%. Obviously, America is somewhere around 90%. But the thing is that Nigeria in 2017 was only 15.3%, and that was excellent. But now the benchmark is 40% debt to GDP. That's the international benchmark. Now, I give it to the second one that is even more interesting, and that is Forbes. Now, Forbes looked at 3 parameters. He looked at the debt, then he looked at the foreign reserves, and then looked at the debt to GDP ratio. And I will give you only 4 countries, 3, and Nigeria 1. Now, America, their debt is $21 trillion compared to their reserve of $125 billion, just 2.5 times Nigeria's reserve. but their debt to GDP ratio is 76%. Now, UK borrows 2.3 trillion against a reserve of $164 billion, and their debt ratio is 89%. Now, China, surprisingly, is borrowed 4.3 trillion, but they have a healthy reserve of 3.1 trillion. But even then, their debt to GDP ratio is 41%. Now, Nigeria comes next. Nigeria has $73 billion borrowing, a reserve of 47 billion, and then 21% debt to GDP ratio. Now, look at what Forbes said. Forbes voted Nigeria as the best debt management in Africa. I think they're actually short of saying that Nigeria is the best management in the world. But that is not a reason for us to ignore the debate on debt sustainability. I think we should take it on, head on. We have a debt strategy in the country, and it flows from the 2017 Economic Recovery and Growth Plan. The key elements of this is to rebalance our debt so that the domestic debt will come down from 89% to 60% and stop crowding out private investment.
These countries that you have named, the US, China, the UK, Japan, and all of them, yes, indeed, their debt to GDP is humongous compared to Nigeria. But a lot of people will tell you the debt profile of this country is actually quite justifiable. Can you justify that of Nigeria with the level of infrastructure deficit and all other
weak institutions?
Yeah, weak institutions, over bloated government, you know, cost of government and cost of recurrent expenditure and all of that.
Okay, I'm glad you actually mentioned one word, infrastructure, because that takes me to the vision. You see, now there are several visions of Nigeria. Now, 2050, we're expected to grow our economy to $6.4 trillion, making us the 10th largest economy. Then the second vision is that by 2030, our economy will grow to 1.64 trillion, and this is PricewaterhouseCoopers. Now, the thing is, you couldn't move to that level unless you grow the infrastructure. And if you notice that all the countries that I have mentioned that have violated the international benchmarks of 40% debt to GDP are doing so freely and willingly because they have infrastructure. And that's why, if you even look at the UK, when you add our 89% debt to GDP ratio, and you add the domestic, it's over 500%. But the fact is this, we have to get there. And the strategy to get there is very important for us to discuss. Now, we have a debt strategy. The debt strategy wants to rebalance the foreign and domestic component, which is doing, and the target is 60-40. 60% bringing down the domestic borrowing from 89% to 60 to stop crowding out private investment so that that window will continue to bring economic opportunities. But then the second one is to deepen the bond market. As you could see, we have Sukuk bond, we have green bond, we have diaspora bonds. That is intentional, to deepen that so that the bond market will bring more resources to the country. But having said that, there are serious issues about the current level of debt financing. That I understand. Now, the benchmark should be about 40% debt financing to revenue, government revenue. Now, government revenue is very low. Let me tell you how low it is. Even the Economic Commission for Africa, or West Africa, we have the monetary zone. The convergence criteria for single market, for single currency is one that we should be at 20% revenue to GDP ratio. Now, Nigeria is about 6%. Now, which means that the tax we are collecting is only 6% of our GDP. We need to do that 3 times more. Ghana is about 15%. South Africa is 18%. No, average Africa is 15%. Ghana is about 18%. South Africa, 24%. Now, Nigeria needs to grow that. But there are positive moves. We must recognize when there are positive things going on in the economy. The Inland Revenue has increased the 20 million people in the tax base to 35 million people and institutions. So that's very encouraging. You could see them returning 5.3 trillion naira revenue and projecting to go as high as 6 to 8 trillion. Customs are doing better, well over 1 trillion now. But that is not all. We have a bigger source of revenue, and which is implementing the FRC, that is the Fiscal Responsibility Commission operating surplus template. Now, that is key because of all the 122 MDAs, agencies that are listed in the Act, in 2007, only 10% of them are contributing to the consolidated fund.
Yes, that's
and
a good point. That's a good point you just made, Professor Kenife. A lot of people are saying, look, if there is a need, if Nigeria's debt to GDP, debt to revenue ratio is to be sustained, there is a strong need, a serious need to actually allow the private sector to, actually lead the charge in order to build a robust economy. How sustainable is it when government seems to be at the forefront of this?
Well, this is one of the ongoing debate. Yeah, look, listen, when you face the issue, I was trying to unpack the revenue side before coming back again to the debt side. Let's go back to the debt. Now, the key issue about the debt is what are you borrowing the money for? And how best are you making use of the opportunity to borrow international? International money is cheaper. Some could be 0% or 2% or 5% for 40 years, 10-year moratorium. There's absolutely no argument that it is the better way to grow our infrastructure. But the thing is that you should, whilst on one hand, the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2007 excluded recurrent expenditure from international borrowing, it shouldn't allow every capital expenditure to go to international borrowing. The reason is that let's use the bankable projects. Let's borrow international money for bankable projects that are capable of retiring the loan. And the moment you get to this arena, private sector is there with you. Because when private sector engages, government has less incentive to borrow. What are you borrowing for when private sector can deliver the infrastructure for you using their own money? And the banks, international finance institutions, are happier to lend that money to develop the infrastructure, lend it to the private sector. And that's why they've also created infrastructure, free grant-based infrastructure project preparation facility, up to $1 million, $2 million to enable private sector prepare the projects and then make them bankable. So that is the path to grow our infrastructure, and not to carry anything called capital and inundate it on international borrowing. You shouldn't do that. Even the money we are taking from China. If you do that, what you are going to do is that you quickly will rise to the benchmark, and then you'll stop growing the economy. Which you should use your domestic borrowing, use your government revenue to do those infrastructure projects that tickle your fancy.
All right.
But if
now,
they are
Professor,
bankable,
Professor, the point there is, besides the federal government, another disturbing area that this source of this debt are from the states. The 36 states, they all owe different amounts of debts. Their debt profile range from one to another, as the case may be. But how more complex are the debts from the states to the whole mix? When we're talking about what is good for Nigeria, if you narrow it down to Lagos, you narrow it down to Rivers State, you narrow it down to Akwa Ibom or even Kano State, Benue and all of that, they all have their various levels. But when the states are taking debts and their debt profile is compounding or is compiling, as the case may be, how more complex is the situation? Listen,
the federal government is actually stricter on the states in relation to their own borrowing. They're stricter. Let me tell you, give me 2 examples. If a state wants to engage in external borrowing, they have to go through the debt management office. They have to go through rigorous due diligence checks. They have to even check that the debt is sustainable in terms of their revenue, and then make sure that they are not going to be they are not going to have fiscal stress as a result of that extra borrowing. So they do that. And if you want to go through the bond market, the SEC enters into the equation. The debt management is in the equation. They check that you have also complied to the FRA, that you have got the Fiscal Responsibility Act implemented, and that you have the commission set up. And they're going to look through the viability of the project. SEC goes through all that to show that the project is viable and can return the money over a shorter period of time before they actually approve. So they are more strict on the states borrowing externally. But then we need to ask the federal government to do the same to itself and borrow less for frivolous and not bankable projects. Use your internal generated resources and use your domestic borrowing.
Would that include
should be for capital project that should repay itself and engage private sector?
You took it right out of my mouth, because I was going to ask you if it included, cutting cost of governance and, of course, cost of recurrent expenditure, which takes a huge chunk of the annual budget, every year. That has been the nature of things for a long time now. But are you concerned about the long-term impact this could have on future generations, which is what IMF and the World Bank have said, that, we may not see the immediate impact of this huge debt profile now, but down the line, looking at the future, it will be a real bad debt trap for future generations?
Without a doubt. Without a doubt, if we don't control the expenditure to bring it down to manageable level. Look, if you are hit with crisis, there are three things you do. First of all, you need to cut your coat according to your size. You reduce the fat in your body so that you don't die. It's more expensive for you to maintain yourself when you are carrying too much.
Some of us are working hard at it.
Obesity. So the thing is, we have to cut down to size. Then secondly, you look to your savings. If you have savings, then you can invest your savings going forward. We do not have savings. Then the third thing is to look at what can you borrow from. And then you turn around and say, how about my private sector? Can we borrow from the private sector? And if you look at all the master plans we have in this country, the 2043 master plan, infrastructure master plan, the 2020 Vision 2020, look at all those plans. They plan for over 40% of the financing to come from the private sector.
All right,
so
Professor.
that realization has always been there and integrated in the plan. But we must operationalize those.
Okay.
And get the private sector. You want to build rail? Yes, rail is viable because you can charge money on the rail.
Okay.
You want to build major highways? Of course it is viable. Just get a toll gate. Get the private sector. They will do it quickly, design quickly, fund it quickly, get it all moving, and then you start getting your money.
Okay.
And not this whole budgeting process that will, for 10 years, you are still on 100 kilometers of road, rolling the money over. And
all right, Professor,
it's not going to work.
Yeah, Professor
and you go more in debt, you hit your ceiling, you leave the whole debt to future generation to repay.
All right. Professor, we have to leave you here now. Thank you very much for talking to us. Professor Kenny Fair, expert, macroeconomic policy expert. Thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
You're still watching TVC Breakfast. Let's go on a break, and we'll be back to talk about power generation, power issues in Nigeria. It's one topic that Nigerians love to hate. Stay with us.